Candilejas, teatro y espectáculo con César Vidal.
We're back for this very special moment in the Friday night in our program, La Voz, that is related to very, very special persons. You know, sometimes these very special persons are persons that are well known over all the world. Is this Oscar winner director, it's this ballerina, it's this singer that is known in the whole planet. Sometimes we have people that are only well known in their countries, and we are very interested in people knows persons coming from other countries that has a very high level, but unluckily they are known only in their own countries. And sometimes even we have very special people who are well known in some region, some town, some part of a country, and we are interested they are very well known over all the world. Our guest of tonight is an exceptional person. I have read several of his books. They are extraordinary, well-researched, well-studied books. And now he's teaching at the School of Political Studies and the Conflict Studies and Human Rights program at the University of Ottawa, Canada, but he held academic positions in the past at Harvard University, the State University of New York at Potsdam, the University of Toronto, and the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. I have read several books of our guest of tonight, and he's a person with an incredible and deep knowledge of the history of Ukraine, but of today's Ukraine. And his last book, I have it in my hands, is The Russia-Ukraine War and its Origins from the Maidan to the Ukraine War. I introduce you to Ivan Katchanovski. Mr. Katchanovski, very welcome to La Voz.
Thank you for the invitation and for the great introduction.
First question. Why are you so interested in Ukraine history and also in today's Ukraine crisis? That's why you was born in Ukraine, or there are more interests than only the birth?
Yes, I'm originally from Ukraine. I was born in Western Ukraine, close to Poland, but I interested in this topic of the conflicts in Ukraine and politics and recent history of Ukraine because I research these issues as a scholar, as a political scientist, and I do this since I wrote and defended my PhD dissertation at George Mason University in the United States in 2001. And I published many books and many peer-reviewed journal articles on this topic. So this is the main area of my research, and I follow the current war in Ukraine very closely. I published open access book, which is free for anybody to read and download and translate in any language. There is already interest to translate my book in Spanish language from Spanish professors. So this is, I think, a main topic of my research, and this is also very important because the conflict in Ukraine and war in Ukraine has significant implications not only for future of Ukraine, but also for many other countries, including countries outside of Ukraine, including Spain and other European countries and countries even in Latin America and Asia and so on.
Mr. Katchanovski, I must confess that I have discovered you reading your work about the Euromaidan. I was really surprised because you was offering a very different view of the popular view broadcast by the Western media. When you look at the Euromaidan crisis, what have you found? A mass protest, a revolution, a coup d'etat, or a regime change?
Yes, I published also a book on this topic called The Maidan Massacre in Ukraine, the mass killing which changed the world. And in my book, I present various evidence, and in my recent book, I also present evidence that this Maidan was not only mass protest, as was presented by the media, according to dominant media narrative, but this was also a coup, attack, and also this was a United States-led regime change. And I do this based on variety of evidence, in particular about the Maidan massacre of the police and Maidan activists in February of 2014. And the evidence is clear that this massacre was conducted not by the Yanukovych government forces, but it was conducted by elements of the Maidan opposition, including far right, including neo-Nazi and radical nationalists who shot both police and Maidan activists to falsely blame Yanukovych forces and to take power in Ukraine. And they succeeded in this false flag massacre. And this massacre had very significant implications for Ukraine and for the future of Ukraine, because this massacre led to overthrow of Yanukovych government, and Yanukovych fled Ukraine because of this massacre and because of assassination attempts. And there was also evidence that the United States government supported, de facto supported this overthrow of Yanukovych government, and there was admission even by former President Barack Obama, who said after Maidan massacre that the United States helped to in transition of power in Ukraine after the Maidan massacre and before Yanukovych fled Ukraine. So this is, I think, very clear based on my research that this is this mass murder led to overthrow of Yanukovych government, who was falsely blamed for this massacre, including even based on testimonies and Maidan massacre trial testimonies of majority of wounded Maidan activists who testified that they were shot from locations which were controlled by Maidan opposition, not by government forces. And this was even admitted by a verdict of Ukrainian trial. And this massacre escalated into the Russian annexation of Crimea, into civil war and Russian interventions in Donbass. And finally, this massacre led to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and war between Russia and Ukraine. This is a kind of escalation, and this was a trigger of this conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and also between Russia and the West, and also within Ukraine, between pro-Russian regions like Donbass and Crimea, and other regions of Ukraine. And Crimea and Donbass wanted, most of people in Crimea and Donbass wanted to secede from Ukraine after the Maidan massacre, according to my research and according to public opinion polls. This is why this is very important to understand what happened in Ukraine in 2014 in order to understand current war and how it was possible to avoid and prevent this war, and how it's possible to resolve this conflict in Ukraine.
If we are facing really a coup d'etat, and a coup d'etat, well, created by nationalists in Ukraine and also a foreign intervention, which was the reason of this coup d'etat? Put Ukraine under the wing of the West to go more than 1 inch from the frontier of Germany to Russia. Exactly which was the reason of this coup d'etat?
Yes, the reason was geopolitical reason. The reason was to, again, turn Ukraine into anti-Russian state, anti-Russian bulwark against Russia, and also to have de facto to make Ukraine into client state of the United States. And this is what happened. After the Maidan, Ukraine became a client state, and it was used as a proxy in the proxy war also between Russia and the West in Ukraine in order to weaken Russia. And this is based on a variety of evidence, which I cite in my book, even admissions by former Prime Minister of Ukraine, Boris Johnson, who admitted that this is proxy war, and also admissions and statement by head of Pentagon in Biden administration, who said that goal of United States is to weaken Russia after United States and United Kingdom blocked a peace deal which was very close to being signed and finalized between Russia and Ukraine to end this war in Istanbul in spring of 2022.
After the coup d'etat in Euromaidan, there's a very important situation that is the Russian annexation of Crimea. Well, to the west, the official story, the official tale is this was a totally unjustified annexation by Russia. This was a show of Russian imperialism. This was a long-standing plan to take away, to snatch Crimea. But in reality, what has happened after the Euromaidan, that has moved Russia to go into Crimea, has faced Russia a real opposition of the people living in Crimea were identified with Russia.
Yes, this is also based on my research and surveys which I examined, and they show, and I examined such surveys in 1990s and also in before and after the Russian annexation of Crimea, and all such surveys show that there was majority support for joining Russia or seceding from Ukraine in Crimea in the 1990s, and also after the Maidan massacre in Ukraine, after overthrow of Yanukovych government, and also after the annexation of Crimea by Russia. And such opinion polls are conducted not only by Ukrainian public opinion companies, but also by Western public opinion companies. This is, again, very important to understand. Even so, this was illegal annexation under international law, but Russia used precedent of Kosovo, recognition of Kosovo by the United States and other Western countries as independent state from Serbia. And so this is how Russia justifies this annexation. But population of Crimea was different from population of Ukraine because it was mostly populated by ethnic Russians. And all other regions of Ukraine, with partial exception of Donbas, in which there was plurality of ethnic Russians, they had the majority of ethnically Ukrainian population, even Russian-speaking regions in eastern and southern Ukraine. But in Crimea, Crimea was a region in which was dominated by ethnic Russians, and it had different history from Ukraine because Crimea was given to Ukraine by then head of Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, in 1954. Again, this was given from the Russian Federation and the Soviet Union to Ukraine, and for this reason, the people in Ukraine, and people in Crimea have often very different views, and this is a conflict which became an open conflict after the violent overthrow of the Yanukovych government with support of Western countries. And it was predictable, and it was, again, avoidable because I wrote about this in the 1990s. I wrote about this in my PhD dissertation, which I published, and in subsequent papers, in subsequent publications. But there is still denial that that people in Crimea and their views, and this narrative that again, contrary to evidence. And this is why it's important to understand this conflict, even and what happened in Crimea, and how it was triggered by the Russia, it was triggered by the Maidan massacre and overthrow of the Yanukovych government. And Barack Obama, then president of the United States, as I mentioned in his interview to CNN, he stated that Russia reacted to the overthrow of Yanukovych by annexing Crimea. So this was reaction by Russia. There's no evidence that this was planned before the Maidan massacre. This was, again, this is very clear that this annexation by Russia started with majority support of the local population in Crimea after overthrow of the Yanukovych government, after the Maidan massacre, which was supported by the West. So this is, I think, based on my research and based on evidence.
The war in Ukraine has begun in 2014, a kind of civil war.
Yes, and this war took place in Donbas, another region which was pro-Russian region, but not only pro-Russian region. Most of people in Donbas supported various forms of separatism, either joining Russia or independence from Ukraine, or autonomy in Ukraine within a federal state, which was rejected by the central government of Ukraine after the Maidan massacre and after the overthrow of Yanukovych. And this is based on my survey, which I mentioned already, which I commissioned for my academic research and which was conducted by Ukrainian Kiev Institute of International Institute of Sociology in all regions of Ukraine, including Donbass. And this war is classified in my studies and in studies conducted by most Western scholars as a civil war with a Russian military intervention. So Russia supported separatists in Donbass who were pro-Russian after the war started. And also, Russia supported this indirectly, but then there was also evidence of direct Russian involvement in this war in August of 2014 and winter of 2015, when Russia covertly sent their military forces into Donbass to support separatists in Donbass. But most fighters in Donbass were local residents. They were Ukrainian citizens who opposed overthrow of Ukrainian government and wanted to secede because they were pro-Russian in terms of their ideological orientation and views. And this is, again, also important to understand how this conflict started and how it and its nature of this conflict, because this war is misrepresented often as a war between Russia and Ukraine, but this actually there was Russian involvement in this war, but it was a civil war, which again started after the Western-backed overthrow of Yanukovych government by means of the Maidan massacre in Ukraine.
There's an aspect that is really uncomfortable to the West, and it's the way the Ukrainian nationalists have reivindicated the role of characters like Bandera and other Ukrainian nationalists during World War II. They had become national heroes. And there's a common accusation coming from Russia in the sense that Ukrainian nationalist is permeated, is very influenced by a kind of neo-Nazism of far-right movement. In reality, which is the real role of the far-right in areas like Euromaidan, the Maidan and Odessa massacres, or the Donbas war? There was really an important role of the far right of Ukraine. This is a kind of legend.
Yes, I think this is also a very important issue which is misrepresented by the media and politicians in the West, because based on my research, which I published in academic venues, in peer-reviewed journal articles, in my academic books, far right is marginal in Ukraine in terms of their numbers. They are not majority of Euromaidan activists. They are not majority of Ukrainian armed forces, and Ukraine is not neo-Nazi state, contrary to what Russia claims. But far right, including open neo-Nazis like from Azov movement, they have oversized power in Ukraine, or disproportionate power in Ukraine, because they rely on violence. And they took part and participated and were involved in the Maidan massacre, in other cases of violence during Maidan protest, during Euromaidan in Ukraine in 2013 and 14. They also took part in the Odessa massacre, and they admitted this publicly, but they were never prosecuted, never investigated, because they joined Ukrainian government. They were integrated in the Ukrainian police, security service forces, and military, and far right, and including open neo-Nazis from Azov battalion, which now became the Azov regiment, now became brigade, and now even expanded even more. They participated in these cases of violence, and they also were very, very actively involved in the start of the war in Donbass, in the start of the civil war in Donbass between pro-Russian and Russian-supported separatists and central government of Ukraine, because they established their own military formations like Azov battalion and right sector volunteer army, and they for this reason they have weapons. They know and they rely on violence, and for this reason, far right and including open neo-Nazis, I think have become very powerful in Ukraine, because they were also able even to openly threaten Zelensky, who was elected on platform of peaceful resolution of the war in Donbass, but they threatened him openly that he would be killed if he would reach a peace with Russia or would make a peace deal with separatists in Donbass. So this is now a very important issue, and it is very clear that far right, including open neo-Nazis, are very powerful in Ukraine, but Ukraine is not a neo-Nazi state, contrary to what Russia claims.
How is possible that President Zelensky, who is himself a Jew, could be so tolerant to this kind of movements?
I think he's a politician who is very interested in only in himself, in his own interest. So he was elected on a peaceful platform, but because of far right threatened him, so he became afraid. And so he basically caved to far right and tried to placate them, tried to integrate them into Ukrainian government and Ukrainian forces. And he basically adopted a lot of ideas from the far right, including slogan of Slava Ukraini, or glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes, slogan which was first adopted by the Bandera faction of Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists in 1941 in Nazi-occupied Poland in their Congress. And they based this slogan, this greeting, based along with like fascist hand salute. It was based on similar greetings of Nazi party, of fascist party in Italy, and other fascist organizations during World War II and before World War II. So now Zelensky basically adopted a lot of kind of ideas and even symbols of the far right, and he tried to kind of support far right organizations, including the Nazi Azov, because they can overthrow him. They have power to overthrow him, like they did with Yanukovych, and they rely on violence, and they're also very powerful, and they're also very ideologically motivated. So that's why they play an important role now in fighting against Russia, because they are very ideologically motivated to do this, contrary to many Ukrainians, ordinary Ukrainians, who need to be mobilized by force and taken by force into mobilization centers, and many of them desert after doing this or try to resist such mobilization.
Mr. Katchanovski, we must talk about the origins of the Russian-Ukraine war. If we listen the Western media, the Western politicians, this war is only due to the Russian imperialism, and Russia is wanting to create the annexation of Ukraine, of conquering Ukraine, and after this, the Russian tanks could arrive till Lisbon or Gibraltar. This would be, in a very simple way, the story told by Western media and politicians. If we listen Russian media, the idea is we are stopping the advance of the NATO. We are protecting our borders against the expansion of the NATO, against the promises that the West has made to Mikhail Gorbachev and as well Boris Yeltsin. Which is the truth in these two stories? Which of these stories is closer to the truth, to the reality?
So again, I based my research about these issues on evidence, and evidence is clear that NATO enlargement and NATO accession of Ukraine became a major issue, and it was used as a security threat by Russia because Western countries tried to turn Ukraine into bulwark against Russia, into proxy against Russia, into client state against Russia, after the Western supported violent overthrow of Ukrainian government during Maidan in 2014. And so this was a real issue, a real threat, but Russia inflated this issue because Ukraine could not join. There was no real chance of Ukraine joining NATO membership, but I think, and there was no kind of any immediate plans to do this, but this was most important issue. This was a major factor of the Russian invasion because this was a real threat to Russia, and they regarded this specifically that Ukraine became a client state of the United States, and it was used as such to weaken Russia. So this was a real issue, a major factor of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I also cite in my book and research this issue of Russian imperialism, which was also important factor, but it was less important, much less important than NATO expansion and turning Ukraine into U.S. client state, because Russian invasion did not have a goal of occupying and annexing entire Ukraine. Russia did not have even military large enough to do this. So the initial goal of Russian invasion was to basically force Zelensky and his government to accept Russian demands of NATO membership, of neutral Ukraine, and demilitarization of Ukraine, and basically do a regime change in Ukraine into government which would be pro-Russian or neutral government in Ukraine from a government which was a client state of the United States. And also they wanted to support Donbas separatists and to either annex Donbas or to make it independent, or to leave Donbas as a pro-Russian region within federal Ukraine. But Russia also viewed parts of Ukraine in the east and the south, specifically Crimea, especially Crimea and Donbas, but also neighboring regions as a part of Novorossiya or New Russia, and they regarded them as historically Russian region. So this was another issue of why Russia annexed these regions. But this happened only after the failed negotiations, peace talks between Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul, which were blocked by the West. And even so, Ukraine and Russia came very close to reaching a peace deal then in spring of 2022. And as a part of this peace deal, basically Russia agreed to withdraw their forces from entire territory of Ukraine, with exception of Donbas, whose status was to be determined during direct peace talks between Putin and Zelensky. And also Russia even agreed to have a Crimea, status of Crimea to be recognized as basically decided later after the end of the war, again as a part of Russia, but Russia basically agreed and withdrew their forces from Kiev region as a part of this peace deal. So there was no initial goal of basically occupying of entire Ukraine, and even there is no evidence whatsoever that Russia wanted to invade other countries, including Baltic states or Poland, or countries which are located in Europe, other countries located in Europe, including like Portugal or Spain or France and so on, or Sweden. So this is pure propaganda. There is no such evidence whatsoever, and Russia does not even have such power to do this, to occupy entire Ukraine, even if they wanted to do this, because their size of military force is not sufficient to do this, even to take entire Ukraine. And that's why I don't think that this is, again, this is based on any real evidence.
Mr. Katchanovski, right now we know that in 2022 it was possible to arrive at peace in the Russia-Ukraine war. There was a deal, you have talked about this, in Istanbul, and in this moment the British Premier Boris Johnson visits Zelensky to tell him that he cannot stop the war, he must keep warring. And we have discovered a few weeks ago, that Boris Johnson has received at least 1 million sterling pounds from one of the industrialists, one of the leaders of the weapons industry in UK. Do you think that the war has been keeping during these 3 years almost, because this is a big business, because there are Western powers who want to grab the wealth of Ukraine, or because this is a proxy war and NATO is using the war in Ukraine to erode the power of Russia, or maybe the three things are alike?
Well, I think that geopolitical reasons, using Ukraine as a proxy, as a client state of the West, of the United States, is the main reason, or the main factor in this case, not economic factor, not oil, not natural resources, because Ukraine does not have a lot of oil, does not have a lot of other resources. There are some um, like minerals which were recently wanted by the Trump administration, but this is not a major reason for this, because I think Ukraine originally was very close to Russia. Historically, it was linked to Russia, and eastern regions of Ukraine used to be part of Russian Empire for a long time, for centuries, and then they were part of the Soviet Union, in contrast to Western Ukraine, which used to be part of Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then part of Poland, Romania, and Czechoslovakia until World War II, until they were incorporated by Joseph Stalin into Soviet Union. So proxy war is geopolitical reasons, specifically for proxy war, was the main motivation of the West to prolong this war after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And this was admitted publicly by many top politicians, including by Boris Johnson, who recently said in his media interview, who said that we need to admit that the war in Ukraine is a proxy war, that Western countries use Ukraine as a proxy, and they use Ukrainian forces as a proxy against Russia. And similar statement was made recently by U.S. State Department Secretary Mark Rubio, who said the same, and also by many other politicians. And this is very clear that Western countries use Ukraine just as a tool against Russia to weaken Russia, and they are not concerned about Ukraine. They are not concerned about Ukrainians, and in any other way. But they only want to use Ukraine as a tool. But the fate of Ukraine, the fate of Ukrainians, do not concern them, and negative consequences of this again do not concern them, because Ukraine has no real possibility. And it was very clear from the start that Ukraine would not be able to defeat Russia. And for this reason, I mentioned in my book and in my interviews and my publications and social media comments that the best option for Ukraine always was to have a peace deal, to prevent this war or to end this war via peace deal, and this would have saved a lot of lives of Ukrainians, and would again made Ukraine a country which would not be devastated by the war, and would have made Ukraine a peaceful country, and would have enable Ukraine to minimize its negative consequences of this war if such a peace deal were to be reached. And according to my research and according to a lot of evidence which I cite in my recently published open access book about the Russian-Ukraine war and its origins, there was such real possibility to reach such peace deal in Istanbul in March and April of 2022, just a couple of months after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But according to a variety of sources, including admissions by head of Ukrainian delegation at this peace talks, by admissions by two members of Ukrainian delegation at this peace talks in Istanbul, and also admissions by Israeli Prime Minister, former Israeli Prime Minister, admissions by former German Chancellor, admissions by Turkish President and Foreign Minister of Turkey, and admissions by other members, other people who were involved in such peace talks, including even a statement recently by Victoria Nuland. Western countries, specifically United States and United Kingdom, blocked such a peace deal. And they did this again for geopolitical reasons, because they were interested in using Ukraine again to weaken Russia. They refused to provide guarantees to Ukraine, and this was stated in Ukrainian media that after Boris Johnson visited Ukraine and met with Zelensky, he told Zelensky that West would not provide guarantees to Ukraine, and he said that Ukraine needs to fight against Russia, and this is what happened. So Zelensky basically followed Western policy and made Ukraine into proxy again, and fighting the war with Russia as a proxy for the West without any real possibility of defeating Russia and winning this war. So this means the longer the war would continue in Ukraine, the more territory Ukraine would lose, the more people, more Ukrainians would be killed, mostly military, but also civilians, and also more damage to economy would be inflicted on Ukraine by the Russian forces, which has also recently happened when Russia hit energy, power stations, and destroyed many of them. And there are now blackouts in Kiev and many other cities of Ukraine at the start of winter. So this is, I think, very clear that a peace deal was very close to being implemented, to being finalized, but it was blocked by the West for geopolitical reasons, to make Ukraine as a proxy against Russia and use it to weaken Russia.
There's a question, a very delicate question that has been running during the war, and is the question related to genocide or war crimes. There had been a genocide in Ukraine. There had been war crimes in Ukraine during the war.
I think both Russia and Ukraine claim that there was genocide in Ukraine. Russia claims that there was genocide in Donbass, of Russian speakers in Donbass, and Putin justified invasion of Ukraine for this reason. But also Ukrainian government and media, and also many Western governments and media claim that there was also genocide conducted by Russia during this war in Ukraine against ethnic Ukrainians. But according to my research, there is no evidence of either Russian genocide or Ukrainian genocide in Ukraine, and this is based on a variety of evidence. For instance, number of casualties in Ukraine, civilian casualties in Ukraine, which is documented by the United Nations, is about 15,000 people, civilians who were killed during this war. And if you take into account some other civilians like who were killed in Mariupol, based on documented evidence and reports from about number of graves, we have about 20,000 civilians who were killed during this war in Ukraine, and this includes about 4,000 civilians who were killed in territories which are controlled by the Russia and separatists in Donbass. So this means that that if you're looking to compare civilian casualties to military casualties, this war in Ukraine is one of the, I think, we have one of the lowest and possibly lowest ratio of civilians to military casualties in modern wars. And this is quite significant if you compare this to many other conflicts, like a war in Gaza, for instance, or war in Syria, war in Bosnia, war in Chechnya, a war in Iraq. Iraq war and many other wars, modern wars, have much bigger, higher ratio of civilians to military casualties, and in many conflicts, more civilians were killed compared to military casualties. But in case of Ukraine, this is opposite pattern, and for this reason, there is no evidence of any genocide in Ukraine, but there is evidence of war crimes committed by different forces, specifically using indiscriminate attacks by and shelling by missiles and weapons, artillery, which are not precise weapons, in territories and areas controlled by, in which civilians live, in cities, and use of such areas also by military forces, and also executions of POWs. And this is took place in different again in different areas, but there's clear evidence of such war crimes.
Do we know how many casualties have suffered Russia and Ukraine during the war, more or less?
Yes, I also mentioned this in my book, and my research is based on evidence which is can be documented, and based on names of Ukrainians who were killed, military forces members who were killed, on a website which is called Ukrainian Losses website. I can, and if you can add number of missing in action Ukrainians, so the total number of Ukrainian forces killed would be about at least 180,000 killed. And if you multiply this a typical ratio of wounded to killed 4-1, so we would have also such number of wounded. So this again by ratio of 4. And if you look into Russian casualties, the number of Russian casualties documented by name by BBC, Russian service of BBC, is about 125, or now I think maybe slightly more in recent days. But number of Russian casualties killed would be about 125,000 at least. And in addition to this, there was about 20 or 25,000 casualties, military forces members killed from separatist Donbass. So they are basically Ukrainians who fight on the side of Russia or on the side of Donbass separatists in this war between Russia and Ukraine. So total number of Russian and separatist casualties will be at least 150,000, and total number of Ukrainian casualties would be military casualties killed would be at least 180,000, and the number of wounded on each side would be can be multiplied by 4. And this is again very important to rely on documented evidence, because media and governments often have just report inflated numbers or numbers which are totally unreliable, and each side inflates casualties of opponents or enemy, adversary, and this is again often misrepresented, specifically to claim that Ukraine suffers much smaller number of casualties, and this is done, or Ukrainian casualties are never reported, and this is done specifically to prolong this war and to pretend that Ukraine would be able to defeat Russia and or to stall Russian advance, which is again not likely based on my research.
Now, if these numbers are true, and I have not any reason to doubt this, it's almost impossible that Ukraine could win this war.
Yes, it was very clear from the start. I mentioned this even before Russian invasion of Ukraine, and even when I said this was a real possibility of war between Russia and Ukraine. And also after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there is basically close to zero chance that Ukraine will be able to defeat Russia. And the reason for this is that Russia has bigger military size, bigger manpower. Russia can mobilize much bigger size of military compared to Ukraine. It also, Russia has bigger weapons, larger weapons, stockpiles, and more advanced weapons like missiles, and which Ukraine does not have. And Russia has other advantage, which include specifically nuclear weapons. And so this would mean, even in very unlikely case that Ukraine were able to defeat or to kind of to move to Crimea, for instance, as Zelensky promised. In such case, Russia could have used nuclear weapons or set of nuclear weapons to prevent this. So that's why there was no real possibility for Ukraine defeating Russia, and this was clear from the start. But media and politicians, and including in Ukraine and the West, pretended, and still many of them pretend, that Ukraine is winning this war, or that Ukraine is able to achieve stalemate with Russia, to basically contain Russia, contrary to the evidence. And because of bigger casualties of Ukrainian forces compared to Russian forces, and bigger size of Russian military potential, Russian military potential, there is a very significant possibility that Ukraine would not be able for a very long time to continue this war, and the front can collapse, specifically without Western support. So without Western support, Ukraine could have been defeated in the first few months of this war. But Western support, military support, weapons, intelligence, information, targeting data, planning of operations of Ukrainian forces, and giving money to finance Ukrainian budget and finance other and other expenses of Ukrainian, including payment of salaries to public officials, to teachers, doctors, and so on, enable Ukraine to continue this war for such a long time. But again, even in this is not can be prolonged for indefinitely, and now it becomes even more clear that Ukraine would not be able to continue this for a very long time. And so, possibility of defeat is real possibility of defeat. But I don't think that that this total defeat or total capitulation of Ukraine can happen. The more likely outcome would be a partial defeat of Ukraine, in which Russia would keep part of territory of Ukraine in eastern and southern Ukraine, and there would be also very likely change of government in Ukraine, because Zelensky would not be able to survive if a peace deal would be reached in Ukraine.
I agree totally with you, about the question of the impossibility, the total impossibility of Ukraine winning this war. But I must confess that I'm totally puzzled when I listen European officials telling that we're going to have a war against Russia, and Russia is going to be defeated, and Russia is going to be divided in 17 different countries, etc., etc. And you can listen this to European politicians and officials, not only in Poland or in the Baltic republics. You can listen this in Italy, in Holland. This is a totally crazy kind of talk. But anyway, Mr. Katchanovski, uh, how do you imagine the end of this war? Finally, there will be a kind of deal between United States and Russia is going to keep Crimea and the Donbas, and Ukraine is going not to going into NATO, is going not to join the NATO, or this is going to be a long, long war like Vietnam, for example, in with the West trying to erode, to weaken Russia. How is the future that you could imagine?
I think it's again not easy to predict exactly what would happen, but based on my research, I can say that again, defeat of Ukraine, partial defeat of Ukraine is very likely, and there is a real possibility of a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia with participation of Trump administration, because Donald Trump made his priority during election campaign and after he became U.S. president to end this war in Ukraine. So this is very likely that the United States can play a bigger role in the end of this conflict and in reaching a peace deal, some kind of peace deal in Ukraine. But which would again already Donald Trump accepted publicly and stated that Ukraine would not join NATO. This is now off the table, and this can be also part of a peace deal, which is key Russian demand. And he also said that United States plans to recognize Crimea as part of Russia, and de facto recognize other territories which are annexed or occupied by Russia currently as also as a de facto part of Russia without international recognition of these regions, recognition by Ukraine. But the question is that Russian demands are now much bigger. So Russia would not agree just to end this war on the front line, on current front line, because Russia also claims control of the entire Donbas, which is now not only part of most of Donbas, which is already kind of controlled by Russia, but also Donbas, which is still controlled by Ukrainian forces, including now cities of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd and Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, which again remaining cities under Ukrainian control. And according to information by the media, Putin agreed basically to end this war if Ukraine were to give up control of a remaining part of Donbas. But Zelensky refused to do this because he would again face kind of his future as president of Ukraine, and even his life can be in danger if he would accept this, specifically from far right, including neo-Nazis. So he again, and Trump could have again pressured Zelensky or to make Zelensky to accept this deal, but Trump did not do this so far, and he tried to portray himself as mediator, but and he stated that he would want to have ceasefire along the current line of conflict, but this is not very likely. Russia would not accept this, and Putin regards this as a conflict in which Russia has ability to defeat Ukraine, and so he has no incentive to stop this war and accept such just ceasefire. So Russia wants to have a peace deal on the terms which I mentioned, and it's very likely that Russia would be able to achieve such peace deal with Western with participation of the United States, and Ukraine would become a neutral country with again with Russia taking control over a significant part of eastern and southern Ukraine, and definitely definitely Crimea, which would remain in Russia, even so it might not be recognized by Ukrainian government and many other countries, and also Donbass, very likely almost entire Donbass, again, or entire Donbass or most of Donbass, and with just some exceptions, with minor territory of Donbass, with the exception of minor territory of Donbass, would become a part of Russia, would be annexed by Russia, and this would also include annexation of other parts of Ukraine, including parts of Kherson and Zaporizhia region. And there is possibility that Russia can even take more territory of Ukraine if the war would continue, and this might include territory in which is now the Russian forces in Dnipropetrovsk region and also in Kharkiv region. So this is a real possibility that Russia would be able to annex even more territory, but not entire Ukraine. So this is not likely to happen, and so Russia would never annex entire Ukraine, and this is specifically because Western Ukraine is very anti-Russian. So and Central Ukraine is also does not support Russian annexation. So in contrast to Donbass and Crimea. So this is why again, most likely outcome would be on the terms which I described, but there is also possibility that this war can continue for kind of maybe again not as in current form, but maybe as kind of guerrilla actions after some kind of peace deal would be again violated again, and this war can resume if again Ukrainian government, the Western governments would continue to again to try to try to reverse defeat in Ukraine and try to again continue this war, or if Russia would regard this try to expand their influence on other territories of Ukraine.
Well, I must tell you that during the last times I had been living in Washington, D.C., and I can tell you that there's a real dislike referring the promises made by President Trump related to the end of the war in Ukraine, for example, and how these promises had been not fulfilled. And this has had consequences, for example, in the elections of the several days ago, because a good part of the the MAGA movement supporting President Trump is resenting the situation in Ukraine, is resenting the money this is costing to the American citizens, and how this promise is not fulfilled, is not honored. So that, well, we're going to see in the future how this situation is going to develop. Probably is not the road that a good part of the European countries would like, for example, UK or France or Germany. But really in US, there's a real situation of people tired, really tired, because of the delay to end up the war in Ukraine. This is totally undiscussable. Well, Mr. Katchanovski, I must thank you for your time, your patience, your kindness in having this time with us, talking about this wonderful book, The Russia-Ukraine War and Its Origins. Is a masterwork related to the war in Ukraine, but also of the preamble, of the prologue of the war in Ukraine. And in other times, Mr. Katchanovski, when these interviews were made in a studio set, in radio, face to face, I used to give one of my books to the person who has been invited, like you, well, signing the book and telling you have not any obligation to read it. This is only a small token of because we thank you your patience, but this is impossible online, so that I give a music, a song, a piece to the persons who are so kind, so nice to give his time to us, as your case. And I'm going to leave you with the suite of a movie that now would be impossible to have in Hollywood. This is a movie of 1962. Its title was Taras Bulba. And, well, the movie was very positive, referring Russians against the Poles, and it was a very popular movie. I have watched the movie when I was a little child, and I'm going to give you the suit of this movie, and I hope that we can meet together in the future again, because I'm totally convinced that you are a top specialist in Ukraine history, but also in the analysis of today's Ukraine. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Katchanovski.
Yeah, thank you for the interview, and thank you for praise of my book. And actually, this movie is about Ukrainian Cossacks. So this is a very important part of history of Ukraine as well. So this is also very relevant to our talk. So thank you.
El programa La Voz es una producción de Artorius Incorporated y al amparo del derecho a la libertad de expresión. No se hace responsable de las opiniones vertidas en el curso del mismo.